Ian Cunningham delivered that straight talk about Kyle Pitts' future in Atlanta, as well as the end of the Kirk Cousins era.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And I am, of course, your humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons, we are breaking down our biggest takeaways from what new Falcons GM Ian Cunningham had to say to the media today at the scouting combine, talking Kyle Pitts and Kirk Cousins' future, or lack thereof in the latter's case, right? Kyle Pitts officially getting the tag today and what that means for his future. Kirk Cousins getting potentially designated as a post-June 1 cut officially by Ian Cunningham today, and the Falcons are not bringing him back. But the reason why we're talking all about Ian Cunningham's presser is because we got virtually, again, maybe you guys feel differently, but I got virtually a nothing burger from Kevin Stefanski at this point in time. Anytime Kevin Stefanski has a microphone in front of him, we will use that as our sleep aid, right? It might as well be 1,500 milligrams of melatonin at this point in time. But, you know, getting to a far more interesting presser was Ian Cunningham confirmed that the Falcons would be placing the franchise tag. That official transaction did go through on Tuesday, the only transaction across the league, which is placing that franchise tag on Kyle Pitts. But to me, the key takeaway was the explanation that Ian Cunningham had for why they made that move, which is basically what I've talked about them potentially doing, which is it's really about buying them time to evaluate. And we talked about this yesterday about sort of the buzz around this move is like, oh, the Falcons might try to work out a long-term deal. And we were skeptical of that. And the way that Ian Cunningham talked about it, it was just like he didn't make it sound like this team was committed to Kyle Pitts, like they were making the franchise tag because they were committed to getting a deal done with Kyle Pitts. It was just like, hey, you know, we've been on the job for a short time. We didn't want to just let him walk out the building, given that short period of time and not think it through and maybe live to regret that decision. And this move is really meant to buy them time. And, you know, I've expressed my thoughts on the decision to tag Kyle Pitts. I don't think it's the ideal move, but at the same time, I think it's the right, or I shouldn't say right move. I think it's a safe choice, right? And given the circumstances, again, it buys you that time. And, you know, gumming into the building and basically making the big move to let Kyle Pitts walk or to sign him to a long-term extension, I think would have been moves that the Falcons may have lived to regret had they made those moves. And so essentially they're punting that decision to down the road. And obviously, you know, we'll talk more about it over the coming 5 months, but the Falcons will now have basically 5 months between now and the middle of July, and we'll get the exact date at some point in July where the deadline is to sign a player under the tag to a long-term extension. But like we'll talk more about, you know, the potential of what the Falcons can do with that. But like I said, it adds you time. And, you know, ultimately, I'm not convinced that, you know, as we get more time, whether it's 5 months from now or a year from now, that we're going to come to a different conclusion that I think the Falcons should already be concluding. But, you know, I've been around and Ian's only been around for what, like 6 weeks, right? But, you know, I think a year from now, you're probably going to be in a position to let Kyle Pitts walk in free agency, a move that they're not necessarily ready to make today, but maybe they'll be ready to make a year from now. Or, you know, they could, in theory, obviously work out a trade of Kyle Pitts between now and November when the trade deadline happens. And the main reason I think that is probably the path we're headed down is because I don't think Kyle Pitts works with Bijan Robinson and Drake London. Right, we have 3 years of those three guys working together, 4 years of Pitts and Drake working together. And, you know, we talked about this on yesterday's episode, but like, you know, everybody's going to convince themselves it's going to be different this time with a new coach and new quarterback and all that stuff, you know, and we talk about, oh, the different quarterbacks and the different injuries and different play callers. And that's really been the catalyst behind why Kyle Pitts hasn't succeeded to the degree that people think he should have succeeded in Atlanta. And I just feel like that's people overthinking what is pretty simple, as we've explained before, is that both Kyle Pitts and Drake London are big slots. And Drake is a better big slot than Kyle Pitts is. And we saw in the final 7 games where Kyle Pitts was being utilized primarily as a big slot, and he thrived in that role. But guess what happened in those 7 games? You didn't have Drake London. Drake London missed 5 of those games. And then for the other 2, with that knee injury, he was not the same player that he was. And, we'll probably get more into this as the offseason unfolds. We'll get to a quieter part of the offseason, but we'll get into the numbers that really back this up, right? And, when we talk about Pitts' fit with Bijan Robinson, right, he's not necessarily a guy that's a power blocker. And ideally, your tight end would be someone that could be more of that front side blocker. And for those of you that don't know, front side versus backside, right? Front side is if you run to the right, the front side blocker is the guy that is lined up on the right and blocks at the point of attack. And the backside guy is the guy that runs, lines up on the left side and is not at the point of attack. And Kyle Pitts has become a much better inline blocker over the last 2 years than he has, but he's almost always a backside blocker rather than a front side guy, which is Charlie Warner, which is why when people sit here and go like, one of the criticisms that you've heard over the years is like, oh, well, wherever the Falcons motion Charlie Warner, that's where they're running it to. And it's like, yeah, because if they decided to run it in the opposite direction, the play probably wouldn't work. But, I don't say this to be a knock on Kyle Pitts. I think the world of Kyle Pitts. I really do. I know it doesn't sound like it. I just don't think he meshes that well in Atlanta for this team in the future. And, I think he would mesh much better on a team that would feature him a lot more in that big slot role than the Falcons can with Drake London on the roster. And I think it's in the team's best interest and Kyle Pitts' best interest if they, part ways at some point this offseason, right, and trade him potentially for a 3rd round pick or something like that this offseason. I would absolutely do that if that offer comes in. And, nothing that Ian Cunningham said today suggested that, any of those moves, trading, keeping, or on the horizon. But again, he emphasized it's buying them time. And again, I think that strongly hints that the Falcons will at least explore their options with Kyle Pitts rather than making a long-term commitment with Kyle Pitts at any point in the next 5 months. And I do think if the right tag and trade does come along, they will certainly explore that offer. So we will see on that front. But when it comes to the tag and trade, I think it's in everybody's best interest. And I said this last week on the pod, that that gets done as soon as possible, right? That works for Pitts, that works for Falcons, that works for his new team, right? Pitts, you get paid sooner versus later. The Falcons, you free up that cap space that you can now use in free agency sooner versus later. And the new team can sort of designate the cap space that they need to acquire Kyle Pitts and bookmark that or earmark that so that they can be more in control of their offseason as well in order to absorb any new deal from Kyle Pitts. And so basically my big takeaway from listening to Ian Cunningham, was that he didn't really give that ringing endorsement suggesting that Kyle Pitts is in their long-term plans, but obviously didn't rule that out. And ultimately that decision will be made further down the line. But, more importantly, right, it was a breath of fresh air, guys. Having a general manager that was forthcoming with information, unlike Ian Cunningham's predecessor, Terry Fontenot. It's just refreshing to hear a GM be upfront about things, basically being like, here's what we did, here's why we did it, as opposed to talking in circles as his predecessor did, right? And, he was also forthcoming about Kirk Cousins' future, saying that the Falcons will cut Kirk as a post-June 1 designation and that he will not be back in Atlanta. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So it's draft season, and yeah, we're in combine week, but we're not talking about NFL draft prospects today. We're talking about the 5-hour energy flavor draft, breaking down those tasty flavors, which are the best and which just might be the sleepers. The board is set, the flavors are ready, and only one can take the top spot. 5-hour energy has a wide variety of flavors, something for everyone. When I used to stroll into the gas station in the mornings before my day job and grab a 5-hour energy, the flavors were basic back then. It was berry, it was grape, classic flavors, but they've leveled up in the year since. 17 flavors now. Peach Mango takes my top spot with its sweet tropical flavor that takes me away. And I definitely want to try the confetti craze flavor, the sweet birthday cake inspired flavor with buttery, freshly baked confetti cake, vanilla frosting, and that sprinkle of sweetness in every sip. So who's number one on your board? Find your favorite flavor of 5-hour energy shots available online at 5hourenergy.com or Amazon. So I want to thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of the podcast. You are the reason why Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. And the offseason doesn't exist for the everydayer, especially if you join the Everydayer Club. Join the group chat and talk Falcons all year long, right? And get every episode of the show ad-free by heading on over to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com to find out more and how you can join the Everydayer Club. So talking about Ian Cunningham and his conversation about Kirk Cousins, he basically confirmed that the Falcons are planning on cutting Kirk Cousins at the start of the league year on March 11th, and that they did later confirm with Falcons local media that that will be a post-June 1 cut. And, we saw that the Falcons' previous regime restructured Kirk Cousins' contract, and that was to create cap space and still allow them to designate him as a post-June 1 cut, which will allow them to spread out his dead money across multiple seasons, 2026 and 2027. And so before we get into Kirk's legacy here on the podcast, let's break down what the financial ramifications of all these moves. And for those of you that missed our episode breaking down the restructure back in January, we'll sort of catch you up on this, right? So essentially the Falcons did that. They freed up about $33 million in immediate cap space that the Falcons can now use this offseason to build up their roster. And then after June 1st, when Kirk Cousins' contract comes off the books, right, they will save an additional $2 million as him being a post-June 1 cut. And a lot of people don't understand how the post-June 1 cut works. And basically what ends up happening is that works where the cap space is freed up after June 1st. So starting June 2nd, you get that cap space. And so we'll break down kind of how it works. That basically, if you cut a player starting on June 2nd through the end of the season, his dead money gets spread over 2 years instead of one, that if you were to cut him prior to June 2nd, right, pre-June 1, right, it would get spread into 1 year. It would immediately accelerate. So if you don't know what dead money is, our basic example, let's say a player signs a 5-year deal that has a $5 million signing bonus. And basically the way that bonuses work when it comes to the salary cap is they get spread out over the course evenly of a contract. So a $5 million signing bonus over 5 years would be $1 million per year, counting towards the salary cap. And if you cut a player, let's say you cut a player that signed that deal after his second year, you would have $3 million remaining of that bonus. And if you cut a guy between March and June, that $3 million would accelerate immediately to your salary cap as dead money, right? And the difference between what that player's cap hit in that individual year versus that dead money hit is what determines how much money you're saving via the salary cap, right? But if you cut that player after June 1st, after his second season, you would spread that dead money, that $3 million, across 2 years. Now, in this case, the first year wouldn't be an even 1.5 split. It would be the normal prorated salary bonus, signing bonus, I can't talk, of $1 million in year one, and then the remaining 2 years in year two, right? And so when you make a player a post-June 1 cut designation in March, like the Falcons are planning to do, you're allowed to, the new CBA that the NFL implemented way back in 2011, and it continued with the 2020 CBA, is that they allowed teams to basically make post-June 1 designations in March. So you can cut a player in March, but it counts the same way that you would cut that player in June, right? And it basically functions that way, but you don't get that cap space in March now. Right. That's the common mistake that people make, where it's like, oh, we'll make him a post-June 1 cut and we'll get those savings in March. And it's like, no, you still have to carry that player's salary like you were carrying him on the roster, even though he's technically not on the roster because you cut him until June 2nd. Right. And that's why, you constantly hear people, I always push back on this, where people will always list what a guy's post-June 1 cut is as a way to sort of indicate, oh, the Falcons can save a bunch of money. But the problem with that is that money doesn't usually help you, because you don't get that money until June, at a time when it's not necessarily useless, but it's not as useful to improving your roster. It's not like, oh, you take a player like Darnell Mooney, right? If you cut him, as a pre-June 1 designation or just a normal cut, you'll save about $7.5 million against the cap that you can now use in March in order to, improve your roster. But if you designate him a post-June 1 cut, you get more savings, $12 million, but that $12 million isn't hitting your books until June. And at that point in time, who's available, like Calais Campbell and Justin Simmons are like the players that are available in June as opposed to the players in March. So that money's not really helping you. So, that's why the Falcons basically did this restructure with Kirk, where it's like they didn't want to eat all $35 million of that dead money in year one, right? By cutting him before, because he originally had a $57.5 million cap hit. They were going to have to eat $35 million in dead money, cutting him. And so the post-June 1 designation allows them to spread that across 2 years, right? So they're going to get their cake and eat it too. They're going to get cap savings in March with this restructure, but also be able to spread that dead money across 2 years. That's basically why they did this move at the beginning of the offseason. And, they're now going to spread that $35 million is going to be 22.5 this year in dead money this year, and then 12.5 in 2027. So wanted to explain that because there's a lot of confusion on how these things work. But we'll do a full cap breakdown here on the podcast probably next week after the combine, once we, do all our combine reactions and who tested well, and then we do the mock draft, all that sort of stuff. So that's probably on the horizon next week. So we'll get more into that, but I did want to explain that. But now that we know Kirk is officially going to be gone, on March 11th, that's when the league year starts, and that's when you officially can designate these guys as post-June 1 cuts, and you have up to 2. So, it'll be Kirk and potentially somebody else. We'll see if the Falcons use that other spot on a Darnell Mooney or somebody else. But more importantly, the thing that Ian Cunningham said today was Kirk won't be back, right? And so we'll break down Kirk's legacy as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So it's a new year, which means it's time to simplify. And one way you can do that is with easy, reliable dinner plans. And that's why I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Home Chef. They're going to take the stress out of cooking by delivering fresh, pre-proportioned ingredients right to your door with easy to follow recipes that actually taste great. They're rated #1 by users of other meal kits for quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. And it's easy to see why. With Home Chef, meals come ready to fit your schedule with a wide variety of options, from family-sized meals to quick lunches. And there are plenty of options that fit different dietary choices. And if you're also looking to save time and money, Home Chef has got you. Customers save an average of $86 per month on groceries. So for a limited time, Home Chef is offering my listeners 50% off your first box, plus free shipping, plus free dessert for life by going to homechef.com/lockedon. That's homechef.com/lockedon for 50% off your first box, free shipping, and free dessert for life. You must be an active subscriber to receive that free dessert. And we know the pressure is high in the NFL, and so it is also high in your workplace. You got deadlines, overflowing inboxes, in that one position you have to fill sitting wide open like Drake London on a option route. But when the pressure is on, you need the right hire. Indeed is all you need. Indeed Sponsored Jobs is going to help you reach the right people who actually fit what you're looking for. They got the right skills, experience, and location, so you're not just hoping that the right candidate stumbles across your post. Over the next minute that I'm talking to you, companies like yours will have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed Sponsored Jobs, and you can get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions applied. Need a hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. So we knew or thought, had a very strong expectation that the Falcons would cut Kirk Cousins, but we thought there was a possibility, right? And as this offseason has gone on, that possibility has decreased, to a point. And now that possibility of the Falcons re-signing Kirk after they cut him is now zero, right? Ian completely threw cold water on the idea of bringing back Kirk Cousins on a cheaper deal, basically telling local reporters during their scrum after his combine presser, we won't re-sign Kirk, right? So that kills any dreams of continued Kirktobers, in the year of 2026. So we'll have to find something else to celebrate in October, this year. So that's going to be disappointing. And so now that we know that the Kirk Cousins era is officially over here in Atlanta, we can talk about Kirk's legacy. And it's a complicated legacy. I know there's a lot of fans that still have beef with Kirk. I don't personally. Again, it's not because I'm being a contrarian, but one thing that people should know about me is I tend to be much more of a players first guy than a team first guy. It doesn't mean that I don't care about the team, right? But I know most fans are all about the team, and players come and go, and they don't really care about players. It's like you have to be really special for people to care about you. And even when they do care about you, the minute you do something that they don't like, ask Julio Jones, they're like, he's dead to me, right? And I don't typically think that the team is absolutely enduring, and the team is ultimately we all made this choice many, many years ago. For me, almost 35 years ago, to become a fan of this team. But I've regretted that decision ever since. I'm kidding, but to me, the players are really what make this team go, right? Without them, ultimately you're just supporting a jersey, which is probably why so many people are invested in what the jersey looks like, as opposed to me, where I don't really care about that. But I'm sure we'll talk about that later this offseason. But I know this is a minority opinion, but I think Kirk's legacy is less about the disappointing legacy that Kirk Cousins had in Atlanta is less about Kirk's own shortcomings and more about the team shortcomings. Right. I feel like the Falcons essentially failed Kirk more than Kirk failed the Falcons. I know that's not going to be a popular sentiment, but, I thought from the jump the Falcons would sign Kirk, but I also thought that the Falcons would not fall into the trap of what they ultimately did, which is thinking that they're a quarterback away. And we spent a considerable time on this pod back in 2023 and 2024, basically saying, hey, the Falcons have issues beyond just the quarterback. The quarterback might be the number one issue on those list of issues, but it's not the only issue on that list. And I think the Falcons got caught up in that. They ignored a lot of needs that 2024 offseason. They overinvested in the quarterback, paying, an exorbitant amount for Kirk Cousins, the largest contract ever given out to an outside free agent. And then on top of that, taking Michael Penix in the top 10. And I think underinvested in other areas, particularly edge rusher, and then have been kind of chasing that ever since and kind of overreacting and being reactive. And basically last year that led to them overinvesting in edge rusher. And there's still areas of the roster that I think the Falcons really ignored or underdeveloped during that period of time. Wide receiver, cornerback, offensive line, these are areas of concern heading into this offseason. And those were positions that the Falcons largely ignored in the last two off seasons, or were less focused on adding needle movers and more focused on let's just shore up the depth here because we're fine at the top of the roster. And now we're looking at several of these positions and like, well, we need to get more needle movers in the building at some of these positions. And so you go back to Kirk in that 2024 offseason. I think the Falcons made the same mistake that the Saints made the previous offseason when it came to Derek Carr. They had built up a team and they said, oh, we just need a veteran quarterback to drop onto this roster and it's going to go places. And, the Falcons weren't alone in that thought process in the subsequent years following the success of Tom Brady in Tampa Bay, Matt Stafford with the Rams. We saw the Colts make a similar mistake with Matt Ryan. We saw the Broncos do the same thing with Russell Wilson, Derek Carr. I'm sure there's other examples that I'm blanking on right now, but the Falcons got caught up in that. And they basically did the same thing the Saints did, which is like, oh, we'll just get a veteran quarterback and that'll solve all of our problems, and did very little else. And they ultimately came up short. And to me, that's a Falcons issue. That's not a Kirk Cousins issue. They were too complacent about the state of their roster, too optimistic about how overconfident, if you want to say, about their roster, too overconfident about the ability of their coaching staff to kind of figure out the rest and make it all work. And as we discussed on the pod last week, I don't think the Falcons coaching was a disaster as many people think it was, but it certainly was not good enough. And I think ultimately that's the same thing that applies to Kirk Cousins. Ultimately, he had a disappointing legacy, overpaid, all that stuff. He wasn't good enough here in Atlanta, but I don't necessarily hold that against Kirk. And so we'll see where Kirk ultimately lands, if anywhere. Or does he wind up retiring and replacing Matt Ryan at CBS as a broadcaster, as it seems like is a plausible outcome if he does not get the type of offer that he is looking for, which is where a team is committed to him being their starter at least for 1 year. I don't think Kirk is going to get a 2-year commitment like the Falcons were at least financially willing to make, although we know that they did not, verbally make that commitment, or maybe verbally they did, but actions speak louder than words. Ultimately, picking Michael Penix was them basically saying that we're not committed to that. And I don't think that was the wrong choice, but it certainly was a questionable choice. And unfortunately, the Falcons were not good enough to make it the right choice. You know what I'm saying? That's kind of where it is, where it's just like it could have gone either way. They could have made it work, but they didn't. And so now we're here, and now we're sitting here trying to figure out the quarterback situation. But as I'll say, I'll leave it here. We'll always have Kirktober. Right back in 2024, those, frankly, over the last decade, going back to February of 2017, so the last 9 years, I guess, technically, best 5 weeks I've had as a Falcon fan. The most fun I've had as a Falcon fan were those 5 weeks in Kirktober, starting with that win over, not the Saints, but who they beat in that first week. Was that Carolina, right? That sounds right. No, it was the Bucs. It was the Bucs. I'm sorry. The Thursday night game against the Bucs. Of course, that kicked off Kirktober, and it culminated with that win against the Cowboys in at the beginning of November, and then it all kind of unraveled from that point on. But it is what it is. Last thing I'll say before we duck out of here, I know some people still think like Kirk lied about his injury. I think that's one of the most ridiculous takes to have. That's basically you saying that the Falcons training staff is completely incompetent. We saw in the quarterback documentary that like they knew he was injured. The reason why they just didn't bench Kirk Cousins, because they had 100 million reasons why they didn't bench Kirk Cousins, because they guaranteed him a whole lot of money. And they were like, we got to see this through, my boy. And so, they tried to see it through for another 4 games and it didn't quite go. And again, that's on Kirk for poor decision-making, for pressing, all that stuff. But I still see this sort of take of like Kirk lied about his injury. And it's like, no, he didn't. No, he didn't. Everybody knew what was going on. I don't understand why people think that, but it is what it is. Just because Kirk said publicly that he wasn't hurt doesn't mean the team internally didn't know that he was hurt. I think that's just a silly take. So I just wanted to say that to end it here, because this is the last time we'll talk about it, probably, in all likelihood. So those are my thoughts on Kirk's legacy. Tomorrow we'll be probably doing more draft and combine coverage here on the podcast. But I hope you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting for all things going on with the combine in the NFL across the entire league. And of course, if you never miss an episode, the Everydayer Club is built for you. Get Locked On Falcons ad-free, plus members-only Discord access, and so much more. Just head to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, so go check it out. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.